To thank everyone from joining in, thank our panelists. I think Charging the Future and the Power Forward Challenge are tremendous initiatives, and I'm excited to hear about all of the finalists with their technology ideas. And today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what it takes to make those technologies get to scale. And we have an excellent panel, and I will just briefly introduce you to our panel. We have Nitika Sathe, VP at Electra at the Great Center. And Nitika has a long career working in electrification and the electric sector and sustainability. We have from BDC, Business Development Canada, Susan Rohak, and Susan is Vice President of the Clean Tech Practice at BDC Capital and responsible for a $600 million Clean Tech Fund. We have Giles Council, Managing Consultant at Siemens Canada, and Giles is the Smart Energy Lead for Siemens Energy Business Advisory. And finally, we have Sandra Odendahl, VP and Global Head of Sustainability at Scotiabank. So, and I'm Bruce Laurie. I'm president of the Ivy Foundation, and I also meddle in the electricity sector and have for many, many years. So the format today is we've got approximately 30 or so minutes, 40 minutes for questions for the panelists. I'm going to go through the questions, identifying each panelist as a lead on three main topics, and then we're going to open it up for some Q&A. And just to let you know, Sandra, I'm going to start with you. And the first question is related to investments and access to capital. So large-scale clean electrification in Canada will require massive investments in R&D infrastructure. So how do you think public, private, and not-for-profit investment can best be utilized to enable this future?
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the question, Bruce. Yeah, so I think that there's a really important role for all three sectors that that we talk about. Obviously, public sector, private sector, but also not-for-profit sector, in making sure that we get where we need to be with the scale up of electrification. I think in many cases, it really does all start with the public sector. And I think, obviously, setting the regulatory framework, the regulatory environment that enables us to have the right kind of incentives for the private sector to act, and also for the financial services sector and various types of financing, not just from banks, of course, but in order for the different types of financing to feel a certain level of certainty. So I think public sector is really critical. Public policy, also just making sure that the decisions that we make about these long-term investments reflect the broad sustainability desires of our society and of our country. We really want to make sure that those trade-offs among the environmental benefits that we hope to obtain through mass electrification are balanced appropriately with the social implications, both positive, in some cases challenging in different sectors and communities, and of course the economic implications, jobs gained, jobs lost, etc. Those are decisions that as citizens of the country, we should all have a way to weigh in on, and that is through the people that we elect to represent us. So I really am a huge believer in the importance of the public sector in setting the direction on some of these big transformational changes that we need going forward. But that's not to say that private sector, including financial partners, don't play an important role. And on that front, obviously, private sector, I think, is where we get the innovation, is where we get having made in Canada solutions and systems. I think the private sector is also doing a really good job, and continues to need partners to continue this, but in finding solutions that are appropriate for our unique climate. Things that work in Canada's north. There's some very unique challenges to electrification and to providing energy in remote regions, and we have a remote cold regions, and we have some of those, and we need to be thinking about how to be innovative so that we are not leaving anyone behind as we decarbonize. And then I just wanted to in terms of finance, the other thing I wanted to say is that one of the things that we need to do is in financial services is, we are and continue to partner very much with our clients as they are looking for, for ways to be part of the infrastructure investment that's happening, be part of public-private partnerships, and it's important for the financial sector, again, banks, venture capital, the various types of financing, to be at the table and to understand how their role fits into the broader picture. Last thing I want to just say is we shouldn't forget how important not-for-profits are in all this. I think a lot of not-for-profit organizations, and I'm going to name one like Plug and Drive, in terms of we don't think about it as decentralized or decentralized energy resources, but when you think about the way this is going to look, with electricity being generated and stored in buildings, in cars, in your driveway, in batteries, etc. There are a number of not-for-profit organizations that we also need to make sure are brought into the fold, and in some cases they're leading the conversations to make sure that we are getting where we're going on getting the scale up right and getting the education and innovation appropriately supported to move the needle on this. I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. And you described sort of the scale and the significance of this transformation. I'm wondering if you have thoughts, and others on the panel have thoughts on, we often hear about this as kind of the next industrial revolution in terms of the kinds of change, the kinds of investment that we're going to need. Are there things that we can be looking at, historically, that might help us understand the nature and scale of this transformation and how capital needs to really shift and flow? And maybe, Sandra, I'll ask you, but also, I don't know, Susan, if you want to jump in on that one as well, or maybe Susan, you can start.
Yeah, no, I can listen. It takes me back to what my father used to say when I was a teenager: money doesn't grow on trees, right? There is a limited amount of capital out there, and so what we have to do, I think, in private sector, public sector, and within policies, is to make sure that we're putting the money to the best use possible, with the innovations and the technologies that are going to get us along this clean energy spectrum in the direction we want to go. And it means making some hard decisions along the way. So I think we've got to look back and say, what are the one or two key technologies we think will have the most impact and we can get behind, and then really, really support those in a big way, as Sandra said, at all levels of government, public, private, and not-for-profit. So I think it's really imperative that we all sort of beat from the same drum on which direction we're going as a country and which technology we think have the maximum benefit as a country.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, maybe what I'll do is I think we'll have an opportunity to turn back to some of these issues, but I'm going to ask Giles to comment on one of my favorite subjects in all of this, and that is the role of government policy in action. And Giles, companies like Siemens are really at the crux of building out this transformation, and and a company that really understands what the future is going to look like. So from your perspective, what are the top policies that governments should be looking at to move towards wide adoption of clean electrification? And that, for me, electrification is a combination of the actual electricity system and then also the ultimately the end uses that will be transitioning from fossil uses to electrified uses. So, I don't know, Giles, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. So yeah, I mean, policy obviously is a key pillar in establishing a direction, establishing targets, kind of setting the goalpost, but it doesn't necessarily give you the roadmap to get there or even the rules you need to play by. So obviously different levers such as regulation are required. But from a high level, the types of policies that are needed in this space really would be ones that tackle, first the supply of clean energy. So how are we going to get that clean energy supply? Secondly, to electrify the demand. So shift some fuel sources off and replace those with electricity and different end uses. And then also really enable kind of a wider participation and engagement, as the public sector and public funds and incentives can't really keep up with the speed that we're going to have to move at. So, on the supply side, obviously, utilities and infrastructure planning, that's done on a long-term basis. Speeding some of that up or having more certainty as to what those targets are and when they're going to be made is important. When we're looking at, policies specifically for clean energy, we're talking about how do we get more renewables onto the grid. That creates a whole new dynamic in terms of, we're moving from, firm capacity resources to intermittent and variables. So now we have to look at the tools, the technologies, like how are we going to incorporate those in a cost-effective and reliable manner? So obviously energy storage is a big one. And then grid modernization is key to that, especially if that supply is going to also shift to a more decentralized type of model. On the demand side, obviously the key ones there is transportation. And I think there's lots of policies at all levels of government that are furthering that. And the other kind of big ones I'd say would be the decarbonization of buildings and then industry. So whether it's updating our building codes or having other regulations to, again, put time limits on fossil fuels and fleet transformation plans, those are key initiatives that will drive the demand and shift that fuel. And then enabling participation. So you asked about analogies to other transformations that have happened, and one that is very, I think, relevant would be the telecommunications sector, which was another poles and wires business. And what we've seen there is that whole shift from just I'm using it for a single purpose to now people participating in content development and having a lot more choice and really being engaged. And I think that's one of the key areas of the two-way energy and information grid that enables. And what that does is it really unlocks new value streams so that the investment in some of these technologies can be shared by different stakeholders and derive those benefits. So whether it's a prosumer, an industry, peer-to-peer trader, there's all kinds of issues there with getting access to those value streams, getting access to the network, and then the clear, regulations for providing the service and getting incentive that I think are important. And that the last piece I'll mention is just, overriding all of this, it's going to take a societal effort to make this happen. So the fairness and the equality of this transition is very, it's a very challenging one, especially as we're making targeted investments and supporting certain industries. But ensuring that the benefits are equally distributed is something I think that policy really needs to consider.
Great, yeah, thank you, Giles. And I'm going to open this up and ask Natika to comment. But before I do, I just want to remind people that there is a online question form, and if you submit your questions, we will be trying to get to those at our Q&A at the end of this. Natika, did you want to comment on that, and also maybe comment on your experience in different sectors and looking at, you know, what it's going to take to, you know, what kind of policy environment is it going to take to get us where we need to get to, especially, you know, as we all know, the electricity sector is largely not just policy but politics, and you know, we all know there's some challenges there. So, but any thoughts from you, Natika?
Thank you, Bruce. And Giles, you mentioned the term prosumer. So I just want to expand a little bit on how important it is to have customers with us on this journey. As we may put 10,000 policies in place, but if it's not going to stick with the end users, if it doesn't stick with you and me when we go back home, and we make our own decisions on how we spend energy and how we procure it, perhaps within our own from our own roof or within our own backyard. If it doesn't stick at that level, then it's going to be difficult to bring in that revolution. Definitely, clean electrification is the way to go. It's pretty rational and straightforward, but is it sticking with the consumers? So I'm just going to give you the good news and the bad news. I guess I'll start with the bad news. Consumer awareness is pretty limited so far. Yes, we've seen improvements on consumer awareness for clean technologies rising over the past 5 years, but it is still pretty nascent. It's pretty spotty, and there are lots of urban myths. I remember when I was launching the Nissan Leaf 10 years ago in Canada, the biggest number one question I would get from potential customers was, would I be able to take an electric car into a car wash? Because we've all been taught not to mix electricity with water. So there's a huge opportunity to create consumer awareness for what is politically correct for all of the globe, not just for Canada. So here's the good news, that as consumer awareness is being brought, customers are quickly changing their preference to clean technology. So there's a direct correlation between consumer awareness and their shifting preferences. So are we there yet? No, it's there, but not in large scale yet. We're still a few years away from the tsunami when consumers will make that big pivot to move towards clean technologies. So I just wanted to share some results from our recent survey. 3 in 5 customers agreed we need to reduce GHG emissions from energy, even if it means job losses or higher energy costs. So 1/3 somewhat agreed, but 1/4 of the customers strongly agreed. This is a big step forward from what survey results would have been 5 years ago. More than 1/4 are extremely concerned about climate change. 3 out of 5 of our customers say they would likely purchase the next car could be an electric vehicle. And also, just to look at the demographics, Gen Z, so the 10 to 25-year-olds or millennials, the up to 40-year-old, are more likely to exert environmental friendly choices versus the Gen X's or boomers. Now, the money bags are more with the boomers right now, so it will be interesting to see as the Gen Zs and millennials get into that purchasing, when they are in the hilt of their purchasing power, do they stick to what perhaps may be higher up on Maslow's hierarchy as they have more kids and they've got tuition fee and they've got university and they've got huge mortgages, looking at where real estate prices are, will they still stick to their climate change preferences? So that's where, going back to Susan, you mentioned money does not grow on trees. A lot of customers are now questioning, well, then trees don't grow on money either. So what we need to do is provide the customers with a win-win so that it's not a huge hit on their pocket. So the leading reason we see for customers' interest in solar panels and electric vehicles right now is really climate change. But number 2 on that list is price, is cost. A lot of customers are beginning to find it cost effective. When we look at cost parity, we are probably under 5 years away from an electric vehicle being at parity with a traditional car. We are under 10 years away from residential solar and storage on your homes being at cost parity versus traditional bulk electricity. So that tipping point is right here over the next 10 years. And as we get to that tipping point, as consumer awareness increases, customer preferences, I think we can pretty much argue that customer preferences will turn towards clean technologies. The pressure that will put on policy, the pressure that the consumer preference will put on businesses, that's when the full alignment will happen.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you, Natika. I often describe sort of, I'm not really a billiards player, but if you imagine the triangle, and you've got kind of business, consumer, and government, and they're each a corner of that triangle, and we're all the little balls in the middle, and we have to push it together, right? Everyone has to move in lockstep. If one of those pieces gets out of whack, either hangs back too far or tries to move ahead too quickly, the whole thing falls apart. So that's my my little image for how we have to move together. Susan, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. I know you
and to build on what Nikita said, I have a personal story to share, which I don't do very often, but I just bought my first electric vehicle. And sorry, Nikita, it's not a Nissan, but what I bought was, and it's an interesting purchase, and it makes for an interesting analysis. I bought a Volvo XC40 Recharge. And what makes this particular vehicle interesting is it's made in Belgium, and on the conveyor belt right beside it is the exact same car gas model. Right? So it makes it very easy to do some comparisons. And I did that. I wanted to be a informed consumer, and I wanted to do the comparison. So I looked at 2 different things, the cost and the CO2. And what I'm going to tell you guys is a little bit shocking on the cost analysis. Okay, the same Belgium made one car, the only difference between the XC40 Recharge and the XC40 electric or gas, I did the calculations on how long it'll take me to have got what I call the green premium, make up for the green premium of buying electric. It'll take me 13 years with my driving pattern to break even if I give no adjustment to maintenance. Now, clearly they say electric cars are less maintenance. I factor in a little bit of maintenance savings. It might take me 8 years to break even on my financial purchase. And so then I looked at the CO2. Again, very easy to compare these 2 cars because they have the same model in gas and electric. And if you drive your electric vehicle on a 100% clean grid, my car from cradle to grave will be 27 tons of CO2. If you drive it on the average grid of the world, which is 60% still unclean and not clean, 40% is clean and 60% is still unclean CO2 driven energy. It's 50 tons of CO2, my car. The other car on the conveyor belt beside me, 59 tons of CO2, right? So for the rest of the world, the actual difference on CO2 right now between a normal car, a gas car, and electric car is only 9 tons of CO2 through the lifetime. You have to be on a clean grid to start seeing some significant benefits of driving an electric car. The other thing that I think a lot of people are find shocking is when my car and that gas car left the factory, my car was 70% higher CO2, 70% higher CO2. I only got the benefit by driving it 200,000 kilometers. Like the difference in making a CO2 reduction in an electric car comes from driving it through the use phase of the car. So I don't want anyone to think, wow, this is depressing, we shouldn't move to electric cars. I think the message here is 2 things. One, costs and CO2 are going to come down with innovation. And that's what all the automotive manufacturers are working on right now, is how can we make these cars a better purchase from a dollar perspective and a CO2 perspective. As Nikita said, there's some huge developments being done on an annual basis to bring these factors down to make them more on par. And so I think early adopters, I think it's almost good that we're not selling too many of these cars, because I think they're almost like the VHSs of cars right now, right? We need to spend money. We need early adopters to buy these and validate, but we've got to see the innovation before we start seeing big volume on the road and big volumes of purchases. So I think early adoption of these cars is great to signal to automakers to spend and innovate. And then we've got to start seeing the volumes once the innovation has happened and these cars become a little bit more CO2. Like the benefits of CO2 have to happen sooner and more clearer, I think, for the average consumer, for them to make a lot more sense on our grid.
Yeah, I think the other consideration there, and I agree, I think there's definitely improvements to be made in how we account for the life cycle cost. And if we can stand up industry closer to the point of sale, that's obviously going to help. But if we think about the cost of, not buying an electric vehicle today, if you're buying any fossil driven asset, you're locking in those emissions for 10 to 15 years. And if our targets are at 2030, where they really start to kick in, every time we delay the purchase of one of those vehicles or an alternative that doesn't rely on fossil fuels, we're making that harder. And that is, I think, where policy can come in to try to help, one, bridge the gap on costs. So with our federal government incentives, provincial government incentives have been very effective in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, and now in other provinces. So I think that's a key role to kind of bridge some of those divides. And then again, like get the source of your energy to be clean, because we really need to have that happen sooner rather than later.
Agreed, and I agree. The premiums, the tax benefits for buying electric is what's going to drive consumer behavior, because clearly most people don't think 13 years out when they're buying a car. It's really hard to justify that capital expense now for something that you're only going to see benefits sort of net in 8 years, right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
And Susan, I'm curious if you got a lower insurance. I did. When I switched over to driving electric, my insurance went down quite a bit. So
no, mine didn't. No.
Did you compare versus?
I mean, I was driving a 17-year-old Volvo before this car, so my insurance was pretty low on my 17-year-old Volvo.
Chances are, if you do the comparison, you may be there may be a bit of saving there in insurance as well. Okay. But all things said, yes, we are not at parity right now. The tipping point is not right now. For those who drive more, you're going to benefit more. For those of us like in Ontario, the ministry has recently asked Ontario Energy Board to look into providing an ultra low electricity rate at night, which is extremely conducive for electric vehicle charging. This was based off a pilot that my team had worked on at Electra over the past few years, where we were able to showcase that there is a win-win-win for the customer, for the grid, and for the greater society in terms of GHG reduction. So depending on where you are, depending on how much you drive, depending on which car you pick up, you purchase, cost parity for some of us is today, but for most of the people is going to happen within 5 years. So we are beyond the past, or we are beyond the phase where green tree huggers and technology pioneers are buying the car. The fact that 2 of us out of 5, 6 of us are definitely driving electric, we are now closer to the pivot than we've ever been before.
I was just I had a quick question for Susan. I'm fascinated by your analysis of the footprint of the life cycle. And did you look at any of the other factors in your car? Now they're both made in Belgium, so that the labor, it's the same. But I guess the piece I worry about is in all of the the work that everyone's doing to decarbonize the economy, are we forgetting about some of the social costs and social impacts of the materials going into, for example, into batteries? like, did you have a chance to look at any of that? Like, where does all this stuff come from, and should we be worried?
No, and you're absolutely right. When I said the cost of the electric car coming off the conveyor belt 70% higher, it's because of the lithium and because of the aluminum. A lot more aluminum goes into an electric car, and that's driving up. And there's obviously lots of innovation going into battery technologies to reduce the amount of lithium, to have alternatives to lithium, to recycle batteries, to refurbish batteries. So I think, you know, there's many, and that's what this is about, and what these challenges are about, right? Is to make sure that innovation is happening at that early sort of R&D stage, so that we can advance these technologies, so that incrementally, like lightweighting of cars and aluminum replacements, like all that together is going to build a better vehicle. And we need to continue sort of like, look at the first gas automobile, what it looked like versus what we're driving today. All of that now has to happen in electric cars as well, right? So it's an exciting time, I think, to be part of this and be and to see the changes. And then with that comes the need then for the bigger infrastructure grid, right? Because as more and more people have cars, you know, another thing that was surprising to me, when I went to get my level 2 charger put in, the guy was saying, well, do you have a hot tub? I'm like, no. He goes, because if you have a hot tub and a car, you're going to need to have a different amp on your house, right? The houses are made to handle an electric car and a hot tub. So our thirst for electricity, is making us make some right now decisions if on the direction we're going to go. So this is going to affect houses of the future, because maybe people in the future want a hot tub and an electric car. So, you know, lots to come with respect to making this all work, and we're going to see lots of I think really interesting changes.
Yeah, and I think, Susan, those are both real world examples of how policy can fit in, as in we need to have a building code that puts a 200 amp service in, and the investment that we need for infrastructure. People, you know, think about transmission lines. They don't often think about, you know, the transformer at the end of their street and the transformer stations that are converting the power into the system. Like, it's going to take a lot of investment, and that investment is going to be a combination of public and private, just to tie things back into Sandra's original comments. I'm going to, oh, sorry, Nitika, go ahead.
Make a quick comment here. Yes, there are a few hurdles to figure out along the way, but they are manageable. We don't need to go and upsize the transformer on the street, the green box on the street, to ensure that the customers can drive clean. It's a matter of figuring out managed charging solutions, and that's what utilities like Electro are currently working on. So I would say go ahead, make your clean choices, and we want to be an ally with the customers to figure out what solutions need to be brought on the utility side.
Excellent. And I'm going to warn people that might want to ask a question. As you can tell, our panel will talk right through the question and answer period if I let them. So if you don't get your questions in, we will continue. We are getting close to moving into our Q&A, but I wanted just to open it up for any sort of quick final thoughts before we get into Q&A, and we may hear some questions in Q&A as well on this, but that went by very quickly. Any quick and final thoughts from anyone on the panel?
I mean, I'll start off saying I think innovation has to happen at utility scale and at the consumer level, and they meet in the middle. And I think, you know, challenges like these two that are being run right now are perfect examples how I think federal government can make sure that we're supporting technologies that have the maximum chance of being commercialized and having a market. So kudos to all the finalists for being in this, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you commercialized and helping make me able to have a hot tub and an electric car.
or a hot tub in your electric car.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd second that, just in the sense that in order to, you know, realize the benefits that are associated with these targets and with this transition, you need to have it at scale. You need to be able to have it to be sustainable. So, getting that, these technologies over the hump of the innovation hump and then getting them deployed and getting them ramped is definitely an area of focus we all need to be keeping our eye on.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra.
I would third that, and I think it goes back to the so completely agree with what Susan and Giles just said. The innovation is fantastic to see, and it's definitely going to get us a long way. Hopefully, will also get us to solutions that are more cost competitive as well. Innovation at the large scale, and even some of the components in the final consumer products might be made in a much more innovative and lower cost manner. But I actually think that the thing that resonates the most with me in this discussion and in all of the net zero, low carbon, including electricity decarbonization, is we really have to crack the code, as Nikita said, about consumers. If nobody wants to change their behavior and they're not incented to do so, all of the pressure on supply in the world, if you can't make somebody buy something they don't want, or you can't blame people for supplying things that people continue to indicate that they really do want. So we really need to make sure we are not forgetting that we've got to think about solidifying demand at the right price for these solutions, or we're going to be in trouble.
Really well said, Sandra, Susan, and Giles. I just want to reiterate the importance of the power of partnerships. 50 years ago, in their careers, people just had to look at their own silos, their own businesses. A great example is you look at the consumer electronics mega event at trade show in Vegas every year, CES. And in the past, and my husband works for Sony, so he would go for that every year, and he would come back talking about TVs and brown goods and white goods. And then over the past 10 years, he's coming back talking about electric vehicles, and then residential solar storage, and telematics. And now the lines between consumer electronics and automotive and utilities and telematics, and home monitoring, all of them are completely getting blurred. So there is a generational opportunity for us to partner up. It's about co-opetition, not competition, as we try to figure out and innovate with intention to put some solutions together that should definitely be shovel worthy. So money does not grow on trees, but it also needs to be, it should be shovel ready, but it also needs to be shovel worthy.
Yeah, and just the last point on that too is that innovation, and again looking at analogs to the telecom and the internet and everything. It's often not just the technology or the widget or the piece of gear that is the real innovation. It wasn't until Airbnb came along and disrupted the hotel game, or Uber came along and disrupted. With the technology was all there, but it was the business model, the financing, it was the customer engagement. Like all those areas are ripe for innovating in this space.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. And we do have quite a few questions that have come in, so I am going to run through them. But I'm going to get one out of the way first. There's interest, Susan, in your case study of your own vehicle purchase.
Yes.
People want to know if you have some sources for how you did your analysis.
So I did the cost analysis just based off of, like I said, I drove a Volvo for 17 years. So I had a lot of data on what my average kilometers were per year. I knew what the cost of gas was. I only charge my car at night, so I know the cost of electricity. And I just did a cost analysis. So that was easy. I will be lying if I said I did my own CO2. I can send you the study. Volvo did their own CO2 study of the two XC40s, and I'm just assuming that their data is right. So if you Google it, you'll find the research on that. It's published online.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And this, I guess really anyone could jump in on this question. I think it's an important one. It's the idea of kind of carbon lock-in. And so the idea that we touched on this earlier, the investments that we're making now in infrastructure and technology could lock in carbon, over the next 10 or in the case of some of these 20 or 30 years. So the question is really, in what ways can we try to avoid that lock-in? And are there things in terms of transitional infrastructure and behaviors that, the examples here, natural gas or mining, that we might want to, try to avert through policies or investments?
One thing that I think can contribute to that is looking at how we, assign or attribute value or attribute emissions to these devices. So in a lot of cases right now, there's some of these new technologies with battery storage that are on the margin or just below it on a business case perspective. When you look at, the cost of energy or losses, like all the kind of technical parameters. But when you expand that to the non-energy benefits, so CO2, the employment that's created, those things that are maybe a little harder to quantify, often the business case that can be derived from those will push it over and can be outsized. So having a good framework that can incorporate a wider view of the value or the benefits from those things could make the decision to purchase or the choice of a technology now instead of 5 years a little more palatable. One thing, go ahead, Sam.
If I could add to that, I would say completely, I was thinking the same. And the other thing I think is that as we're making these investments, to consider at least a couple of scenarios, and not necessarily scenarios for a utopian future that may or may not be possible, but that could be one of them, but also scenarios for with consideration of the social and economic aspects, as Giles was saying. So under under a couple of different scenarios, and valuing the environmental, economic, and social pros and cons of the different potential paths, does this investment still make sense the way it is, or should it be designed in a way that makes it a little bit more flexible as the future might unfold in a way that does not represent the past. So I would just suggest, we have to make these investments. We can't wait in some cases, but we should be making them with a view to investments that tick the range of sustainability boxes, so we don't have regret over causing some huge problem we didn't think about, but B, that they're flexible enough to adjust to a much more low carbon future as well.
Yeah, I'm going to add that you need a robust, number one, carbon tracking system that is standardized across, and it's still very nascent. Businesses are still learning how to count their carbon emissions, and at a personal level, I doubt if many of us are doing that. So first is you cannot expect what you cannot inspect. So the whole awareness around carbon accounting. The second is then that's where policy can then come in heavy with the carrot and the stick. And in carrot, it's the carbon tax, stick is the carbon tax or levies. And on the carrot side that's when incentives really help in pushing and promoting what will become a natural choice 5-10 years later. But in the meantime, how do we nudge customer behavior to pick the low carbon options? That's where the incentives and the programs and the policies to further that behavior comes in very handy. And maybe this is going to be a large scope creep, but end of the day, at our own personal level, if we're serious about climate change, it goes beyond just, it goes beyond our energy choices. At some point, we will have to face, are we in it for economic growth? Because economic growth and sustainability at some point is going to clash, and we will have to pick one over the other or fine tune one over the other. One will have to be a master, the second will have to be to serve it. And also decisions like how many children are we going to have? What kind of a diet plan are we going to have? Those are really, really big elephants in the room. Compared to that, figuring out the energy emissions is a piece of cake.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to weave a couple of ideas that have come forward together. And I guess the general theme is looking both at sort of scale in terms of regions and also kind of regions in terms of politics. And so if you look right now at Canada, we've got, you know, Susan, you talked about the, you know, the extent to which a particular grid is going to make a difference with your emissions of your electric vehicle. And of course, if you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, it's very different than if you're in Quebec or Manitoba in terms of carbon-free emissions. So is that, so there's two questions really. So to what extent is that a barrier or an opportunity for Canada transitioning? And then in the broader North American context, of course, the US is, I think, like 66% fossil fuel electricity, and we're, you know, 83% clean electricity. So, you know, to what extent, again, is it an opportunity or, you know, or a threat for Canada operating in this North American context?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Not, you know, Canada enjoys 80% renewable energy across Canada, but it's not the same across province. Ontario, 93% renewable, which is fantastic, but there still is some coal plants that are operating in Atlantic Canada and in Western Canada. They have plans to be phased out. And that's a perfect example of, you know, when obviously those coal plants were built, they were built with a certain life expectancy, and people didn't have the ability to foresee that maybe we don't need coal in 25, 30 years, and maybe we should be rethinking the build of this. We've got to make sure that when we're transitioning now to a clean and green economy, we don't do the same thing. And the perfect example of that is hydrogen and end use of hydrogen, right? There's a lot of advocates saying hydrogen is the future. I don't disagree with that, but do we want as Canadians and as a society to build out a hydrogen infrastructure, for example, for transport? If we've got the if we know how long it's taking us to build the infrastructure to have EVs on the road, do we now have to build out the infrastructure to have hydrogen? Is that the best use of our limited amount of resources? Maybe there's an end use for hydrogen that's different than transport that we should consider and put our money and resources towards that end use instead of duplicating on having a dual system. So there's some big decisions that have to be made that way so that we don't end up with like a coal plant, you know, a coal plant that no one wants to use anymore that still has good life in it. So lots of hard decisions to be made. I don't think, you know, our energy is pretty good. We've just got to figure it out way now how to make sure that it stays resilient and that we have enough of it for the electrification bubble that's coming.
Great, thanks, Susan. Any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'll move on here. So there is a question, sounds like it's suited for you, Nitika, on the question is very simple. What innovation is expected of utilities?
So I love what Susan just said. It makes it sound like we're in the business of being the gas pumps of tomorrow. We're in the business of providing, we're part of the solution. For once, we are not part of the problem, at least in Ontario, utilities and across Canada as we move towards more distributed energy solutions, which are by far, you know, gravitating towards clean solutions. So then the whole electricity system is gravitating towards clean energy. And that brings utilities into the driver's seat. We need to be there on the table at the design time itself. The example given about you can put a hot water, you can put a hot tub and an electric vehicle in the same house. That's the kind of work that the utilities need to do to make sure you can enjoy the lifestyle you want, and you can make the energy choices that you want to make as a consumer. And if you want to be prosumer, we need to be ready to enable that process. So I would say whether it is interconnection or interoperability, or even for us to reinvent our business model to stay relevant, we certainly don't want to be the blockbusters. But if we don't act nimbly and work in collaboration with our customers and with the third parties, we do, somebody else will eat our lunch. So this train is going to go ahead whether we jump onto it or not. So for that reason, I would say it's imperative for the utility to be at the table, proactively working our way through the process, and in the bargain, we will figure out how to reinvent ourselves.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for that. It's a great answer. So we're getting close to the end here. I don't know if we're going to get through all the questions. I'm going to try to wrap a couple together again. So it's really related to technology, and there's kind of, I guess, two parts to this as well. The extent to which, you know, we actually need new technology, or we just need to do a better job of integrating and using the technologies we have. And in that sense, you know, do we just let businesses go about hoping that this all happens on its own randomly, or do we need a more cohesive and targeted approach? Like you know, I know particularly if you look at some of the work being done in the UK, sort of the industrial strategy approach to basically making sure that these you know, value chains are invested in, and it's not just about an individual technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the landscape of technology options that are out there, there's a lot, and there's a lot that are viable. But one of the key challenges is that whole coordination, the interoperability. How do they work together? How do you ensure that you don't end up with, you know, 100 different standards for a plug? That type of coordination. And then from the technology side, there's a lot of, you know, software and system integration advancement that needs to be made there, because, you know, we're looking at now, again, not just an energy grid, but a communications grid. So, you know, investments in cybersecurity and ensuring reliability of the comm side is going to be equally as important as the energy side. So there's still, you know, a lot that has to be done there from a technology perspective. But again, it's not necessarily the hardware. There's lots of innovation going on there as well.
Right.
Yeah,
Can I second that? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
No, go ahead, Sandra.
I was just going to say, thinking about, you know, full disclosure, Bruce and I sit on the board of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, and I'm just going to give a plug for the Sink or Swim report that looked at, that was issued last year, that actually looked at this, and there have been other really great studies as well that indicate two things. Number one is it's a system change, and I think this is a bit of layering on what Giles is saying, and that is that the technology, arguably we have most of the technology we need to do things, although they may not be available at the price that we want in order to make them scalable and in order to make it attractive to consumers. So innovation, you know, continues apace appropriately, but we don't have a technology problem. We have a systems problem. You can't just, you know, we can't transform this the way that we use energy. The fact that people might want a hot tub and an electric vehicle to be used on the same day or from the same house. You know, we need to think about the whole system and not just the individual pieces of technology. And that's where there's two things. One is absolutely public sector is important, but actually, and complicatedly, public sector at the federal, provincial, and down to municipal levels all weigh in on this. So it's like a four-dimensional puzzle. So you need to have a system thinking in order to actually decide on the technological roadmap to get where we want to go. You can't just be picking the technologies out of the blue. I also firmly believe that if we wanted to, we have the technologies we need. We need to scale them up. We need to deploy them, which is absolutely complicated. But where innovation is serving us well is, again, it's making some of these things much more affordable and easier to do, or easier to augment existing things. I think that's the other thing, is that, you know, how many kilometers of natural gas pipes are under, you know, I live in the middle of the city of Toronto. I'd love, you know, sure, it'd be great for all of Toronto to go electric, but we've got all this infrastructure. So in the interim, is the system change and system thinking going to dictate or point us in the direction of, you know, some interim measures before we scrap those, you know, whatever it is, 10,000 kilometers of natural gas pipes that keep us from freezing to death and in the winter. And, you know, there's a lot of system thinking that has to go into this.
Great, thanks, Sandra. And Susan, I'm going to give you the last quick comment before we wrap up. We're a minute over schedule here.
Good. Listen, my only comment was, like, when you were saying, is innovation required? I mean, obviously, being in venture capital, I'll never say there's enough innovation, because it would be, you know, closing down my whole industry. And, you know, part of me thinks, you know, we really are at the infancy of a lot of things that we're looking at. And if people are happy getting in their Ford Model T and going to Blockbuster to get their movies, then let's stop innovating. But I do think that there's still a lot of innovation that has to come to move these technologies up, to make them more cost efficient and more energy efficient. And it's not just on electrification, it's on carbon capture technologies, it's on hydrogen, it's on small modular reactors, it's on fusion, it's on, there's many, many different sectors. As a country and as a planet, we have to continue to advance so that we're not in our Model Ts and getting our Blockbuster movies.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Well, with that, I'm going to just thank our hosts at Enercan for putting this together, and the gang at Stratos, and also thank each of you, Susan, Giles, Yatika, and Sandra, for a great panel. My quick summary is that it's going to take collaboration, and it's going to take a lot of different pieces coming together in a coordinated way to make all of this work going forward. But I think we got some great insights to some of the big issues that we're facing. And so I'm going to just close off now and thank everyone for a great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Have a
everyone.
great afternoon.
Bye.